And welcome to our third edition of H. Poll's Comps List Radio. My name is Robert Ferguson, and I am joined again by my wonderful co-host, Marie Totten at the University of Central Arkansas. Marie, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. It's beautiful here. We've had temperatures in the 70s, and so that has been such a change from the snow the last couple of weeks. So it's been wonderful. How are you?
Oh, good. I mean, it's we've actually it's starting to feel a little bit like early summer here in the Valley of the Sun in Arizona. And so, but spring training is almost upon us. So we are
Right.
all of the. I feel like we're a colony of the Midwest at this point. Everywhere I go is Chicago Cubs outfits. I mean, I
Right.
live in Mesa, and I'm about 2 minutes away from the Chicago Cubs spring training facility. So everywhere I go is Chicago Cubs stuff.
Oh, that's so neat.
It is pretty cool. It is pretty cool. And I mean, I know pitchers and catchers have reported, but there'll be the full schedules beginning, I think, next week or the week after. And so, yeah, a whole bunch of senior citizens from Chicagoland have descended upon us here, have invaded us. Barbarians have invaded us.
It's always fun. I love baseball, and my kids are about to start, and I cannot wait.
Yeah, I've got a 1.5-year-old, and all I want is for him to play little. I just want at least a few years of little league baseball. Like
Yeah,
that's what I
it's
want.
the best. It's the best.
It is. It is. But you know what else is the best?
Yes,
We're going to use that as a really awkward segue.
I like it.
Um, might be the book that we are looking at this week, Richard Hofstadter's The Idea of a Party System. Marie, this was your wonderful suggestion. It really is a wonderful suggestion. I'd never read it before. I know you had read it before. So, Marie, maybe tell us a little bit about why you were excited to put this book on our schedule.
Yes. So first, Richard Hofstadter is just an excellent writer. The book is interesting. It flows well. It's a great read. But when I first started taking political history classes during my doctoral program, this is one of the first books that we were assigned. And it really changed the way that I looked at political history because of this ideology that at one point, I mean, I knew that Washington didn't want political parties. We're founded on this idea political parties are bad, but I'd never traced how that idea changed. Or even if that had changed and we had just accidentally fallen into this system. And Hofstadter just lays this out so wonderfully, where you see this ideological change from the founding. Basically, I mean, he's looking at 1780 until Martin Van Buren and the rise of the Democratic Party. And so, because you can trace this and you can see this evolution and it shows how our country evolved in a real way. And it just opened my eyes to that. And it kind of spurred this love for not just politics in general, but political history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that said well. This book, maybe we'll focus on one thing. I mean, it is about an idea. This book is about an idea. It's in the title. It's about an idea. What's the idea he's talking about?
It's the idea that there can be legitimate opposition, the idea that political parties were not an evil that the founders thought, especially Washington, but a necessary good that Martin Van Buren argues, and that it has kept our political system, this two-party system of legitimate opposition, has kept our country going throughout this period. And Hofstadter is so wonderful at talking about contemporary politics and issues without overtly saying that he's talking about those things. And so he's writing this in the 1960s, where you do have all of this political upheaval and you have this ideological change during this period. And he's writing this history that connects so well to the contemporary politics he's living through, but he never says it. It's not overt. It's just the ideas are there. The structure is there for that.
Um, in fact, this has been the thing that's been really buzzing through my head the last day or two since, with this conversation coming up. Like so many historians, he's writing about the present through the past, right? And present moment, the moments that he's experiencing are influencing.
Right.
And I kept thinking, why is he writing this book like it was published in 1969? So you alluded to maybe some of your thoughts of why he's writing this book. Can you? I mean, we might be in the world of rank speculation here. He died not long after this book was published, so we didn't really get a chance to talk too much about it. But what do you think is going on that convinced Richard Hofstadter to write this book?
One, he did die very young at 1970, in 1970, and I just lament all of the wonderful history that we lost when we lost Hofstadter, especially if he had lived through Watergate. I can only imagine how he would have talked about that. But getting back to the book we're talking about, the idea is that that legitimate opposition that Van Buren kind of forms with the Democratic Party, that two-party system, those parties had competing ideas, like legitimate divisions in them. And he saw that as a good thing. He saw the conflict as a good thing. And in the 1960s, he's seeing these two parties that aren't that different. The division's not there the way he felt that it should be in the way the two-party system was, like this idea of division that the two-party system was built on. And so he's looking at this, is this really giving Americans a choice? Are both parties so similar that we've gone from the idea that, like we learned our lesson too well, in a way, is what he's arguing here. And so that's how he's connecting it back to what he's seeing. And in 1968, he was so concerned about the student protest he was seeing at Columbia, and he couldn't fully wrap his mind around, like, why is this happening the way it is when it is? And so he's kind of grappling with that throughout this, throughout writing this as well.
Yeah, and I mean maybe, and part of it might be that, and that I honestly got nothing. I agree with everything you said there. In fact, I hadn't thought it out as much as that. Maybe he's looking at this moment in the late 1960s, and because the Republican and the Democratic Party are so similar to each other in the 1960s in many ways, not that this anti-Vietnam, particularly the anti-Vietnam, there's no party championing these views.
Right. They had no outlet, is what he's saying. Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, okay, Marie, that makes a lot of sense. I think I'm convinced.
It kind of clicks into place when you think about it that way, because both parties are anti-communist. Both parties, by that point, the New Deal social safety net is solidified. Some of the Great Society is solidified by that point. And so he sees these student protests, and like you said, there's no party that champions that. So they have no legitimate opposition. And he sees that as a real problem. And so that's influencing all of this.
But at the same time, it's also not just a critique of, well, they might as well be one party.
Right.
The Republicans. He's not saying that either. Like, he's
not
saying
at all.
I think the implication is that it's good that it's two parties.
Yes. I definitely came away with this thinking, okay, he thinks the two-party system is essential for the survival of the American political tradition. And that there needs to be conflict there. And that's new to what he had written before, because he had been called a consensus historian before. And so now he's writing toward the end of his life about how conflict is so essential. And so he's making that transition based on what he's seeing, play out in real time. And so I think that ability to kind of change the way he sees consensus and conflict is important, and shows us, again, I lament the fact that we don't see where this goes ultimately, because I think Watergate would have once again changed the way he thought about politics and would write about them. But we can't know.
Ultimately, I mean, again, in the case of Watergate, I mean, maybe reinforcing some of the points that are made in here.
Right.
And anyway, another interesting connection, of course, with Hofstadter this week in the three that we've done so far. A historian that has been mentioned in both of our earlier podcasts was a student of Richard Hofstadter's.
Yes, Katz-Nelson.
Yeah, Ira Katz. This is apparently a podcast about Ira Katz-Nelson to some degree. So
I've been mentioning Katz-Nelson quite a bit. But yes, he, if I'm not mistaken, it was his senior seminar paper that Hofstadter oversaw. And so, I was reminded of that connection, and I just had to laugh.
So this is interesting. It's Howard Beale and Ira Katz-Nelson through the first three episodes. But okay, Marie, maybe we've alluded to it a little bit. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about Richard Hofstadter?
I covered quite a bit of his life while he was working on this text. Like I said, he changes the way he looks at and writes history over time. He is influenced very heavily by Charles Beard, and we've talked about mention the Beardian school in the past. And so that kind of, Marxist, Beardian economic ideology and then into that consensus school, which I did find out that he did not like being called a consensus historian. He did not appreciate that, and he wrote quite extensively in private letters that he did not think of himself as a consensus or intellectual historian, that he thought of himself as a political historian who happened to study the ideology. Yeah.
That's interesting. I wonder if, especially the term consensus historian, and neither of us were alive when there were many consensus historians still writing. I wonder if it was like an epithet, like that was something that was tossed by their opponents, so nobody wanted to be considered a consensus historian. It kind of strikes me as that kind of very few people are going to. I'm a consensus historian.
Right.
That doesn't sound like a way to build a lot of street cred.
Right. And there's such a backlash to it. And so I definitely buy that it probably was not meant to be a positive. It was not meant to be positive.
And it was one of those terms that was not used by people who were accused of being consensus historians rather than as a term of derision rather than a label to be embraced. But okay, like you did mention, he kind of he's sort of considered to become this liberal consensus historian. What are some? I mean, we talked a little bit about them. I think maybe we weren't yet recording, but what are some of his other books that are sort of more that might even be more famous than this?
Yeah, his The Paranoid Style in American Politics is one of his most famous essays that he has. Anti-intellectualism. He writes quite extensively about anti-intellectualism. He's very concerned by the Goldwater campaign and the Goldwater movement. He wrote numerous articles about Goldwater, and they all approached the Goldwater campaign and movement from a different perspective. But this idea of anti-intellectualism kind of flowed through, and he writes a book about that. Talking about this kind of strain throughout American politics of anti-intellectualism. He writes about populists. He gets a lot of backlash to the way he writes about populists. Woodward does not like the way he writes about populists because he thinks that that Hofstadter plays up on the racism, plays up on some of the, like, Woodward went deeper into this topic, and Hofstadter kind of looked at it in general. And so you see this idea that Woodward is pushing back against what Hofstadter is saying because it is more consensus in a way. And I know that Woodward and Balin were two of the historians that used that term consensus to talk about Hofstadter. So I'm sure that was part of that kind of back and forth.
Yeah, that's interesting because again, before reading this book, my experience with reading Hofstadter, which is largely Age of Reform, Paranoid Style, and then his biography of the three progressive historians, Turner, Beard, and then Parrington, are is one of the patrician. He feels like a patrician when you're reading him to a degree, and that he's perhaps a little dismissive of more small d democratic forces
Right.
in the country.
Right.
And he, it particularly, is, this is unfair, but it's just the way that I read him. Feels like he privileges the East Coast a little bit as the leading force in American politics, as opposed to maybe where the populists.
Right. Right. I agree with that. And he didn't want to be stuck in the archives. So he doesn't look at a lot of primary sources the way that Woodward would have. He's analyzing. His is more analytical of the secondary sources, and he's putting all of that together. And so I'm sure that played a role too. I mean, you have more written about the Northeast than you do when he's writing, especially in the 50s and 60s, than you did about the West or even about the South. And
Yeah,
so I think it probably has a lot to do with it too.
Your comment on him not wanting to be stuck on in the archives is well taken. I remember I wrote a seminar. It was a draft of a seminar paper, and I had my citations, but they were in rough form, and so I just kind of, like, it was a rough draft, so I just sent it in and I said, listen, I was busy, and I was like, all right, I promise you I have my citations, but they're in rough form, and I just don't even want to include them in the paper because it's going to distract from the paper, right? I was looking for feedback. And the feedback I got is, who do you think you are, Richard Hofstadter? There's no footnotes.
Right. Right. Oh, goodness. Oh, I love that. That's funny.
That stuck with me all these years.
Yes, yes. Yeah, no footnotes. Because he's
the only other
historian,
the only other historian with like this few footnotes that you see, now this book's a bit of than Hofstadter, is like Foucault.
Right.
Like Foucault could write a whole book and have one footnote.
Right. Because he assumes, the people reading these books know the secondary literature, and he's just putting it all together. And so, what's the point? Why bother yourself with?
Yeah, why bother showing your work?
Right, exactly. He's Richard Hofstadter, and by 69, everybody is going to believe him.
He's Richard Hofstadter at Columbia, right? There's the patrician kind of hubris there.
Exactly.
All right. So let's dig into this book itself. Marie, you explained it well, that it's kind of tracing this notion, this idea of, like, is a party system, first of all, good? Is it tolerable? And should we accept that in a republic, there's going to be a sort of permanent oppositional infrastructure to the administration? Through the period from 1780 through about 1840. What's his conclusion?
I mean, again, I think he concludes that it's necessary. That, as he traces this, he makes the argument. And I think he does it very well, looking at these kind of flashpoints in our political history. So starting with Washington and the way he's partisan while saying that he's not partisan. He's like, there isn't, not a formed party yet, but there is a faction in his cabinet, in Washington's cabinet. And Hofstadter does a very good job kind of laying this out between Hamilton and Jefferson, and how Hamilton's got Washington's ear and Hamilton is a little more pragmatic. And so the things that are coming out of Washington's kind of in his speeches and in his policy are partisan, even as he's saying, this is the worst thing that could happen. Even as Washington saying, we cannot allow parties to form. And I love that Hofstadter kind of ends that first part of the book by saying, if what Washington had wanted had come true, then the experiment would be short-lived. Because he's arguing there from the very beginning that without the opposition, we wouldn't have made it. There would be no legitimate opposition. Your only option would be to fight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I think is one of the other things that we'll start with the early part of the book here. He's talking about this generation, of the so-called, the founding fathers: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Hamilton, and primarily those figures. And they don't have a fully formed like model of what party might look like.
Right.
They're all sort of knee-jerk opposed to it, some more than others. And they can't quite conceptualize what like Martin Van Buren's going to be.
Right. Right. The idea is that, I'm so sorry.
No, please.
The ideas that they're building on, they're building on Enlightenment ideas, but they're also building on these political theorists. And the political theorists of the time are saying political parties are bad. They will bring down and like the country, and they're building on the English Civil War. Like that's their major example for political parties or factions really at that point. And so that's what the founders are hearing, and they want to be intellectual, and they are very intellectual and very some of them are very ideological. And so as they're building on those, they don't have a good example. Like you said, it's just a knee-jerk reaction that this is bad. And it's not until it's experimented, especially through that era of good feelings, that they realize, okay, this is not working. Like a one-party system is not working.
Yeah, and one thing that I didn't really realize this, I'm not an English historian, is that I sort of imagine, and I teach it in my lectures, which I'm clearly going to have to change now after reading this book, but that in England in the mid 18th century, we're actually like, when we look at people like Robert Walpole, or we're looking at people like Lord North, we're actually kind of projecting anachronistically parties onto them.
Right.
They're not, they are different factions, but they aren't really fully formed parties in the way that I think I assumed that they were. I'm thinking of like Wellington, Palmerston, and the Pitts, and assuming that like Walpole and North are in that tradition of parties, that they're leading parties that generally resemble what they become in the 19th century. But I didn't really understand that parties in England don't really take that form until the mid 19th century, until even after Palmerston.
Right. It's just it's factionalism.
Right.
Right. There's no legitimate opposition is the problem.
Well,
you can't have a party system.
There's no official opposition in parliamentary form, right? Because, in Parliament, you've got government and official opposition. And I sort of thought that went back to Walpole, but I guess not. And so in America, they're kind of inventing this notion in a way that I thought they were kind of just adapting it from England, but they're inventing it according to Hofstadter.
Yes, and I think he makes a good argument that that's what's happening, is as they experience things, they're evolving. And I think ultimately that's the beauty of our Constitution, is that it's elastic enough that it can evolve without falling apart. Like you can create, like Van Buren creates this just incredible machinery and party system because he could without it being unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right, absolutely. I mean, I really like how you said that. This is one of the beauties of the Constitution is there's a flexibility inherent in it, and maybe a vagueness, but certainly a flexibility inherent in it that allows for major innovations while still retaining the constitutional structure.
The ability to amend is incredible,
and the ability to amend,
right?
Yeah. And so this early generation doesn't really have like a fully formed model of parties that they can just like plug and play into the American system. They can't really imagine like, Gladstone and Disraeli, right? And say that this, we're going to have Tories and Whigs, our own version of Tories and Whigs, even if that's maybe what develops. But they don't have that kind of model in their head. And so, Marie, how do this earlier generation, we've alluded to it a little bit already, but maybe we can talk a little bit more about it. What's your sense in how Hofstadter presents like that first generation's view of parties?
It goes from an evil to a necessary, it becomes somewhat necessary to a necessary good. And so this kind of idea of necessary, Jefferson, again, ideally, he doesn't believe in parties, but he is creating this kind of party structure. Like, even as they're saying these things, they're creating the structure that will see the creation of a two-party system. And so when Jefferson talks about this, he ultimately, he's got the Democratic Republicans. He's supporting all of these Democratic Republican societies that are popping up at the grassroots level. But ultimately, he thinks they should be the only party, the only, he says all Federalists are Republicans, all Republicans are Federalists. And so he wants to create this one single party, but he understands that there's opposition at first. He understands that, I think they understand, and I think Hofstadter does a good job with this, understanding the significance of 1800. This idea of this exchange of power, and the first time in the modern world that one party and one faction had given power peacefully over to another. And that becomes like this foundational part of American history. And when that is born, the ability to have a two-party system is born along with it, even though that's not what Jefferson is saying. They understood this in a way, but Jefferson is not saying, okay, now the Federalists are legitimate. He's saying my faction has won and now we are legitimate and the Federalists will fold in. But I think, again, he's acknowledging this. He's allowing this. Jefferson is allowing this to happen, and he's building on this as he goes. And so that election of 1800 just extremely important. But it shows it's already there. The factionalism, the it's not the two-party system yet, but it's there.
Yeah. I mean, and I think what Hofstadter, makes clear is that Jefferson never thought the Federalists were legitimate.
No.
That's one of the key differences between like him and a later Van Buren. Van Buren will accept that the Federalists are legitimate, or the Whigs are legitimate. He just, but Jefferson never thinks they're legitimate. He just thinks that they're a conspiracy.
Right.
But
Adams has handed control over.
And I think Jefferson would look at Adams and think Adams is a Republican. He's just in the wrong.
Exactly.
Right. He might not look at Hamilton and say Hamilton's a Republican, but he would look at, he looked at the Federalists as a conspiracy of a few monarchists that wanted to bring monarchy back to America.
Right.
And therefore it was illegitimate, but that for the most part, they just hoodwinked the Federalists, like the overwhelming majority of people who were Federalists had just been hoodwinked by a few conspirators. And they would all become Republicans.
Yeah, exactly.
And honestly, he's kind of right.
It happens. That's the whole era of good feelings, right? It happens for quite a while.
Right.
A couple of decades.
So, just back to the 1790s for a second, my sense is that Hofstadter believes that there's only really two people in the 1790s of the major elites that he's focusing on anyway, that have a semi-clear understanding of this notion of parties, and that's Madison and Hamilton. Jefferson is looking to organize an organization to destroy the Federalist cabal, but he doesn't have any real notion of parties. And I don't think Madison has a modern conception of parties, according to Hofstadter, and maybe Hamilton doesn't either. But at least Madison and Hamilton understand that they're acting in a partisan fashion.
Yes. Even if that idea of legitimate opposition is there, I agree with you. I think Hofstadter does this well. But they understand that it's factionalism at the very least, and they're acting to support their faction.
And there's mass politics organizing. Even Hamilton is doing it.
Yes, and probably at that point better than anyone else.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting is you've got Washington as the key political, as the face of federalism essentially, and Jefferson is the face of republicanism. But it's really Madison and Hamilton that are the partisan operators here.
Right. And James Madison is behind everything in this era. He's such a thinker. And so it would be surprising if he hadn't, realized that earlier. And he does. He sees that throughout that era and going forward.
And Hofstadter, yeah. And Hofstadter, I mean, there's a line at one point where he says, we're going to talk about Jefferson and Madison here, but really we're going to talk about Madison because Madison was a much clearer thinker.
Right. And he writes everything down.
Yeah. And I mean, and this is what's so interesting about studying Madison. I mean, is that not only is he a political operator, but he's a political theorist.
Right.
And his practice is informing his theory, and his theory is informing his practice. And so this is why he evolves a little bit over time. But, we don't tell the audience this because they taught, somebody in them taught the survey and, taught Federalist 10. But, this notion of pluralism that Madison has in his mind is unique.
Right.
And very innovative. But even then, according to Hofstadter, Madison doesn't quite take that next step.
Right. He's still holding on to that idea. It's not like we can't go that far.
That it doesn't require major party infrastructure, major permanent party infrastructure in order to represent these pluralistic interests. Right? That these pluralistic interests are going to come up, they're going to disappear, they're going to come up, they're going to disappear. It's not, we don't need permanent infrastructure in order to manage it. And I'm not sure what Hamilton thought on that either. Probably he didn't think it required permanent infrastructure either.
Yeah. I mean, and we can't know because Hamilton left the picture too soon, I would argue. Yeah. But I agree with you. I think he probably saw no need for it permanently.
So, and it is interesting, that Washington's farewell speech, which gets quoted a lot. And I love how, you alluded to it, how Hofstadter talks about it. He says, this is entirely a speech about nonpartisanship, and yet it is the most partisan thing Washington will ever write.
Exactly. It is so partisan. And he talks about how Hamilton is in the background there because Hamilton understands this, and Washington is ideologically opposed, so he won't accept it.
And this, I can only imagine how frustrated that would have made a
Right, because they felt like they weren't being listened to.
Well, and to hear this guy go on to talk incessantly about the importance of national unity, nonpartisanship, all while sliding a dagger that was put in his hand by Hamilton, right? And constantly inserting it into the Republican political body. Right.
And they knew Hamilton was their, maybe not enemy, but they knew he was the face of the opposition.
Well, I think they viewed Hamilton as an enemy by that point.
Yeah.
But anyway, so one of the things that I really enjoyed about this book was, I enjoyed many things about it, but his explanation of we talked about the transfer of power, but of Hamilton's role in it. I think that there's this, Hamilton is both this, this figure who does convince the Federalists to support Jefferson.
Right.
As opposed to Burr. And in this case, Hamilton is acting perhaps in a less partisan fashion than many of his Federalist colleagues.
Right. Because they're not all behind him.
No, they want Burr. And they want Burr because they think Burr will burn the whole thing down.
Right. He has no true beliefs, according to Hamilton, where Jefferson at least believes in something.
And Jefferson had been the bête noire of Federalists for most of better part of a decade. I mean, it's hard to imagine, this, and Burr had, not been an enemy of Federalists in the same way.
Right.
He and Hamilton had worked together in setting up like the Manhattan Company in New York City, and it just wasn't the same sort of animosity there. And I can only imagine if you're a Federalist and you're sitting in Congress and you're trying to imagine, like, hey, I gotta vote for the guy who literally has been the face that I have taught myself to hate
Right.
for 8 years.
Yes.
And I gotta vote for him out of principle? But Hamilton manages to convince enough of them to do it.
Yeah.
And this is Hofstadter understanding Hamilton, perhaps projecting Hamilton as a thinker of partisanship, in the sense that, like, he thinks that Jefferson will maintain the constitutional structures enough that will permit a permanent Federalist party to continue to exist.
Right.
As opposed to Burr, it's unpredictable, nobody knows where.
Right. And I think he knew that Jefferson would keep some of the stability, like his financial system, in place. And Burr, like, you just don't know. You just have no idea.
Yeah, I think he put his faith in Jefferson's patriotism.
Yeah. And the fact he was a founder.
Yeah.
He was a big part of these discussions and was very invested.
And unlike most Federalists, Alexander Hamilton had sat in cabinet meetings with Thomas Jefferson. And so he got a true, authentic picture of Jefferson in a way that maybe his Federalist colleagues were getting a caricature. Probably drawn by Hamilton.
Most likely, at some point.
But, Hamilton was in a position to go, okay, I wrote some of the propaganda about Jefferson. I'm actually able to distinguish between the propaganda I wrote and my actual feelings here.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. He knew the background there. He knew the reality.
And there's a really important political lesson in that, which is don't believe your own propaganda.
Right. Right. Know where it's coming from.
Yeah, too often people, political figures who spend years drawing up propaganda and writing propaganda end up becoming so enamored with it that they believe it themselves. And they're like, no, you wrote this.
Right. Right. This is from you.
You invented this.
Exactly.
Right.
They get caught up in their own bubble.
Right. So anyway, so Jefferson's administration, according to Hofstadter, he oversees, not only does he, certainly does not become what Federalists worry that he's going to become. He oversees the Hamiltonian system. He oversees, an expansion of the executive in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think Hofstadter does say that there is still a big difference here between the Republicans, a Republican administration versus a Federalist administration. Do you buy that?
I think so. I think in foreign policy especially, but Jefferson is more flexible than they think he will be. I mean, he is going to really become flexible with the Louisiana Purchase. And I mean, it's not clear if that's constitutional or not, but Jefferson decides to do it. So he's not a strict constructionist at that point. And I think that change, I mean, I definitely think there is a difference between the two and how they would have, Adams or Jefferson, how they would have ruled is the wrong way to put that as a republic, but how they would have presided over the country. But I think that Jefferson was more flexible than they thought he would be, and definitely more flexible than it could have been. A bigger difference, I guess, is what I'm getting at here. That could have been a bigger difference than it was, but definitely foreign policy wise, versus French versus British, who we're going to support, who we're going to fight with. Are we going to fight, or are we going to try to negotiate? That back and forth. So at least in that part, there would have been a big difference.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think Federalists assumed that, like, the U.S. would be at war with Britain by August of 1801,
Right.
as opposed to 12 years later.
Right. Right. Completely different circumstances.
And the other thing that's interesting, and Hofstadter spends a lot of time talking about this, is the patronage.
Mm-hmm.
And that when Jefferson comes to power, he gets rid of the highest ranking Federalists in the administration, but he doesn't purge everybody.
Right. Right. He's strategic about it.
But, so it is sort of this middling kind of way here. Clearly we represent a new party, and therefore the leading lights of the old party can no longer be in their positions of power. But at the same time, we still want to maintain the Constitution, this government, we still want to maintain the loyalty, the overall loyalty of this other party, indicating that maybe you have a future, ostensibly at least. I don't think Jefferson believed they did.
Right.
But, yeah.
If Jefferson's arguing that we're all Republicans, right? That everyone's a Republican. If he purges all of the Federalists, is he not giving legitimacy to them being a separate party? And so that strategy is important that he employs when it comes to patronage.
Yeah, and I think Hofstadter brings this up so frequently. Like, Jefferson was totally confident that republicanism would win the day.
Yes.
He wasn't worried. He's like, short-term federalism's a danger, but long-term we're going to win. We just need to survive. If we survive, we'll be fine.
Right. Right. They'll come back.
And that confidence, I think, allowed him to kind of permit federalism to continue to fester and exist, because he just sort of knew, like, end of the day.
Right. Right. But that opposition is there.
Yeah, particularly in New England. But I mean, is it the 1808 election where I think in 1804 Jefferson wins everything but Connecticut and Delaware?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
And in 1808, I think by 1808 the only state that's controlled by the Federalists is Delaware, something like that.
Yeah, it's right there in New England.
And then of course the Hartford, he mentions the Hartford Convention, but doesn't really go into the Hartford Convention in this book,
right?
Which is probably good. It probably distracts from the overall notion of it. So where does James Monroe?
Well, you've got this period. So you've got Jefferson thinking republicanism is going to win, and for a while it does. And so you've got this era until the 1820s, the era of good feelings. And Monroe is pushing this idea that republicanism is the way forward.
Yeah, I think Monroe, according to Hofstadter, Monroe doesn't think the notion of a legitimate opposition exists.
Right.
He thinks
exactly.
he thinks that that's a silly notion, and in that way he's very much like Washington.
Right.
Even though he's coming from the other side. But what's interesting about Monroe is he's very clearly a partisan operator.
Oh, yeah, they all are.
Yeah, but even more like consciously than Washington.
Right.
Right? Like,
he's not
Monroe
being pushed by Hamilton there.
Yeah, like Monroe is building up the party, and I mean, Hofstadter has a great section where Monroe is communicating with people, explaining, like, listen, this is how you operate in a party. This is what party discipline looks like. This is how we, the party is your North Star, right? And yet he doesn't believe there needs to be two parties.
Right. Right. It's that factionalism is still there. And he sees that factionalism and he sees some opposition, but we're going to remain Republicans and you have to be loyal to these Republicans. And the Federalists are still there in the background. So they still exist just enough that you have to remain loyal to the Republicans. You cannot be part of this faction.
Right. And that's what Monroe's worried about, of course. What Monroe's worried about is that, like, within the Republican Party, that the whole thing's going to blow up into 4 or 5 major factions at any given point. Because, I mean, part of it's because he's communicating with people who are trying to do that. You
Right,
know,
right,
the legacy of the Quids by
right.
1808, 1809. The Quid, you know, again, the legacy of the Quids are trying to put Monroe up against Madison in 18.
Right. Yeah,
Um,
they, I mean, and the party, like these factions are supported by the grassroots. Like again, I know we talked about this last time, but this I have such a fascination with voters and how voters push the political system, and that's what they're doing. And they want these separate voices, even if it's under this umbrella of republicanism. But that's fracturing the way that these politicians think about themselves and the political system that essentially they believe they've built.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and you know, imagine the voters in this period. I mean, this is a tumultuous period
Yes.
of American history. I don't
Yeah.
think, you know, scholars of the early republic who are listening to this know what a tumultuous period this is. But I think, you know, you and I are 20th century historians or late 19th, 20th century historians. You know, I'll be honest, I always forget how tumultuous this period is.
Right. And it doesn't help that we call it the era of good feelings.
Sure, right? Um, but you know, like imagine like you got the Embargo Act, right? Then you know, Madison gets rid of the Embargo Act very quickly because he recognizes that it's destroying the Republican Party,
Right.
right? Um, you've got and then you've got the War of 1812, and then you've got the peace with Britain, and then you have all of these goods flooding the American market. You got the Panic of 1819. You have you've got Spanish Florida. You've got all of these problems on the you know in the or you know you've got problems of expansion and inherent in expansion,
Right. Yes.
and yet it's all being looked over by one political party, and at a time when suffrage is expanding.
Right. Exactly. And suffrage is expanding in these areas on the frontier that do have very different concerns and needs. And the Missouri Compromise in 1820 really blows this up. And you can really see these factions begin to become more vocal and more organized by 1820.
Right, and that Monroe is terrified of the Missouri
Right.
Compromise leading
Yeah.
to creating these factions. I mean, this is a year that he's running unopposed
Right.
for president, right in
Right.
1820.
And how do you keep these sections together? I mean, how do you hold the country together without a national party? Without a party that's going to, you know, bring in these Western and Southerners and unite them with some issue with New England. And is that possible? And so these questions become major concern.
Sure, and I mean, you know, Monroe almost vetoes the Missouri.
Right.
I didn't know that. I didn't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
And
and we teach it as, you know, this worked for a while. You know, we did this, it worked. The question of slavery was solved for, we kicked the can down the road kind of thing. And so unless you dig into it and understand the political nature of this and what that could have done politically without the flexibility we had in our government, I can only imagine what it was like seeing that play out in real time and how problematic that could have been.
yeah, so you know, we're talking, you know, again, all of these figures up until James Monroe are are all, most of them are at least ostensibly anti-party, even though on a day-to-day basis they might act like their party, like their partisans. And Monroe is very dogmatic about being anti-party, or at least that there could be no legitimate opposition in a free. But he is not the last major figure of this book.
No, he is not.
And it's interesting that, you know, that Hofstadter chose to focus on Martin Van Buren rather than Andrew Jackson.
And it's smart. Andrew Jackson was the face, but Van Buren was the architect. And one of the things that I loved most the first time I read this is that it was Van Buren. And it showed how, working behind the scenes, he built this party that still exists today. And he built it I mean, not only did he say legitimate opposition exists, it's necessary, and he started to look at opposition more like in a more sportsmanlike way, where if you don't like me, you vote for the other team. But we are separate teams here. We are separate parties. And he didn't want the Federalists to come into what became the Democratic Party. He believed they should and had to be separate. And Hofstadter does such a great job explaining that, and like explaining, obviously the whole book is how these ideas evolved, but really explaining why it was so important for Van Buren to organize these, like, not factions, but actual parties, and show how a political party could be organized in our system and the system not completely collapse.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what's interesting is that, and Hofstadter makes a really big point of this. Part of this is personality of Van Buren. He's kind of got this bonhomie, like, just kind of, he likes people.
Yeah.
Van Buren primarily likes people. And, he grew up in a tavern, basically. He was a poor guy as a lawyer, at the arguing constantly at the bar, in courtrooms. And I think, when you do that, when you're arguing constantly in courtrooms, you learn to like the opposing counsel on some level. I mean, you might be traveling with them at this time. Right? You might not be sharing a room, but you might be sharing a room.
Right. And you run in the same circles.
Yeah, you have to learn how to be able to kind of just get along with people who you are officially on opposite sides of. One thing let's keep talking about Van Buren. I'm going to go back for one thing. But yeah, that there's this, okay, you're a Federalist, I'm a Republican. Want to go have dinner? Like, that was that sort of Van Buren's way of looking at it. He's like, actually, once you are in separate parties and you're no longer trying to convince them to join your party or trying to coerce them into joining your party, it actually allows people to get along way better.
Right. If you acknowledge someone as legitimate, that's going to work more effectively.
Right. And actually, this, I think, is something that Van Buren inherits from Madison, and Madison's notion of pluralism. And, a lot of where, and this is what I wanted to go back to, is that Hofstadter traces Madison's notion of pluralism to religious conflicts in the 1760s and 1770s, where, Madison believed, he might have been Presbyterian. I don't know that he was Presbyterian, but he ended up at Princeton, right? As opposed to like William and Mary or one of the. And he really believed in religious pluralism because he was of a dissenting faith. And so he didn't want to be coerced to join the dominant faith. And so Madison has this notion of, okay, but that doesn't stop me from getting along with my neighbor on a whole bunch of other things, just because we disagree spiritually.
Exactly.
That there's this, that we can apply that same notion to politics, that there's going to be pluralism, there's going to be people with different beliefs, and that's okay. And that, in fact, it's actually good for society if there's all of these different beliefs. And Van Buren is taking this notion like, hey, you know what? If you just think about it in religious terms, if I'm Episcopal and you're a Methodist, like, if I all of a sudden just accept that you're a Methodist and I'm not trying to convince you to join my church, how much better are we going to get along?
Exactly.
And so Van Buren,
that's the teams, yeah.
Right. He's like, okay, so, we disagree on a couple of core issues, but that's okay. We can still get along for the good of we can still cooperate when we have to. We don't have to cooperate much. We can cooperate when we have to. We can still kind of like each other.
Right.
And that actually makes it easier for the system, for the party systems to function.
Right.
And the whole system to function.
Exactly. And if you start with this basis that both parties believe in the Constitution, they believe in the foundation of the government, and it's just policies that they disagree on, then that legitimacy is easier. Like, it's easier to call your opposition legitimate. And by that point, Van Buren did believe that both sides followed the Constitution, believed in the Constitution.
Right. And I mean, I think that is a little bit easier to some degree when federalism is dead.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
federalism, because of its the odors of monarchism, whether
Right.
that's an accurate conception of what federalism was or not is a separate question. But Republicans certainly thought that federalism was a threat to the revolution. The Whigs are not a threat to the revolution. And so Van Buren at this point can, and Van Buren is of a generation that didn't grow up. He grew up idolizing Jefferson, but he didn't grow up in the battles of the 1790s.
Right. And those ideas that, the founders look at ideas that were there, and they can look at intellectuals and thinkers that had looked at the English Civil War. But by the time Van Buren's there, you had new ideas about parties. You had new ideology coming into the country that said, okay, political parties might not be evil. They may be necessary in some cases. And so not only is he more disconnected from the very beginning, he's got all these new ideas coming in as well. So other people are also more likely to at least, if not accept completely, at least think about this, that political parties, okay, they're not as evil as Washington said.
Right. And that Van Buren also, I mean, we probably mentioned, like, Hofstadter lays a lot of emphasis on Van Buren's experience in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And as the leader of what becomes kind of the Albany Regency.
Right.
And that there is in New York this major factional dispute between DeWitt Clinton and, the Bucktails, essentially. And that Van Buren is the leader of the Bucktails against DeWitt Clinton. And Clinton's a Republican, like Van Buren, like he's ostensibly a Republican, but Van Buren looks at him and goes, but he's a Federalist. He has no business being in our party.
Right. And that's what he's seeing. That's what Van Buren is seeing in different corners from his experience in New York. But that's what he sees at the national level too.
Right.
Is we are not on the same team.
Right. And he's seeing a connection of interests between, like, Albany and, like, the Richmond junto. Right. That he's like, no, we agree on things. Why are we playing with New England?
Right.
We shouldn't be. They're a different set of interests.
Right.
We should be pursuing our own interests against them.
Right. And you can't do that until you have the idea, okay, we can form this. We can have this more than a faction. We can have an actual party. Right.
That can organize, that has candidates, that, competes against others. And, so in this way, I think Martin Van Buren is the originator of America's national sport. Its real national sport is elections.
Yes.
We opened talking about baseball. That is America's national pastime.
Right.
America's true national sport is elections.
Yes. I'm with you on that 100%.
And in that sense, Martin Van Buren is its architect.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've always thought, I'm going way afield here. I've always thought that maybe the greatest cultural barrier to authoritarianism in the United States is America's love of elections.
Yeah, we hold that sacred.
It's I'm Canadian, right? Elections are a big deal in Canada, don't get me wrong, but they do not have the same sort of carnival festival atmosphere that they do in the United States.
Right.
And anyway, and Van Buren is really the architect, or the first guy to really embrace that.
Right. And he knows that in order to convince people to accept this idea and accept that there's another party and join that party and run for office as a member of that party, then you are going to have all that pomp and circumstance. You are going to have to give them a reason to come aboard. You are going to have to promise patronage in a way that John Quincy Adams certainly did not, and to his political detriment. I mean, to
Right.
his extreme political detriment. And so when Van Buren realizes all of these things, he does make it a circus in a way, an
Yeah.
important circus, but it does become quite a festival.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's Van Buren, and according to Hofstadter at least, Van Buren recognizes that he thinks that Monroe and Quincy Adams and their disdain for parties are actually destroying the fabric of the political fabric, and that we need parties to channel these divisions.
Right. Because you can't have the House deciding elections. And that's what happened in 1824. That's what had happened in 1800. I mean, that's not a long period of time. And so if that became a pattern, where is the republic? Where is democracy in any form in that? So I think he's on to something there, thinking, okay, this anti-partisanship is becoming a huge detriment.
And yet, and of course, and this is the Van Buren's bonhomie coming out, is like as soon as they just annihilate Quincy Adams in 28, the only guy to go see Quincy Adams and chat with him and seek his advice is Van Buren.
Right. He did. You're right. He liked people.
He liked people. He would go talk to Quincy Adams. He was, and it was never an obstacle to Van Buren's perspective of the relationship that they were from different parties. He was like, yeah, you're different party, different beliefs.
Right.
Okay, cool.
Right.
Right. What's your thought on Russia?
Right. Because he saw him as legitimate. He saw him as legitimate opposition. So why wouldn't you get those ideas? Why wouldn't you talk to someone in the other party?
Right. Once you accept that there's this general commonality in support for the Constitution and support for the American Republican experiment, all of it, you can get along. If you're in different parties, you can actually get along. Whereas if you're constantly trying to coerce the other, it becomes almost a religious exercise in evangelism that is bound to fail.
The choice needed to be there is
right.
Essentially what Van Buren is saying.
One thing, and I really, we're reading this one book across a week, and or two, a week or two, and that should be enough time to dig into every aspect of the book. But of course, naturally, it isn't. I have 2 little kids at home, and I was trying to finish up this book last night, and my daughter was trying to get me to play. She was trying to get me to play school, where she was going to be the teacher and I was going to be the student, and that went on for hours. So
that's more important.
It was more important.
That is more important.
So the last section of this book, Marie, I'm hoping you maybe got a chance to read more of it. He talks about how future thinkers, like after Van Buren, start to think about party, both social scientists and otherwise. I was really curious in Hofstadter's take on Tocqueville. And I know he mentions Tocqueville, but I didn't really actually get a chance to dig into it. Were you able to?
Yeah, I mean, the way that he ends the book is this, that's where he brings in the more contemporary. So he is uniting these two ideas and how the party evolves over time from an evil to a necessary good. And so he's kind of tying all that together, and he's talking about kind of what we talked about before, but this idea that we wanted division. And we needed that division when Van Buren was there, and we wanted the parties to be different, and we needed to accept that, and we needed that. And now we've kind of overlearned that lesson where the parties are not are we back to, is what he's arguing in the 60s and the 70s. I would not make this argument today. But he's saying, are we back to this idea of a one-party system? And he did not believe that that was sustainable or would work long term. He thought the opposition was necessary. And that's what he's really doing, is he's tying up all this ideology in that last chapter.
So fast forward to today. One of the things that Van Buren, believed that people should be in separate parties, and we don't, and it's okay that people are in separate parties, and we should just cooperate with each other regardless. Or it shouldn't be an obstacle to necessary degrees of cooperation, I should say. It's probably a better way of putting it.
Yes. Yeah.
And, Tocqueville has this notion of great parties versus small parties, where like great parties are where there's major interests at stake, where each party represents major actual legitimate interests. Whereas like small parties, it can be personality driven, it can be just like ephemeral notions. And in fact, it's the battle between small parties that is actually way worse.
Right.
Whereas the
right. And that's what he's saying. Yes.
Right. Whereas the battle between great parties, when you've got like actual interests at stake, allows for a couple of things. One, it allows for, I think, friendlier cooperation in the sense of like, hey, I recognize you have wildly different interests. And so it shouldn't be an obstacle to our, again, varying degrees of cooperation.
Right.
I mean, I'm asking a contemporary question, which is not really what we want this podcast to be about, but do you see major differences in interests today between the Republican and Democratic Party, or are the differences small enough that each party really believes that it can convince the other to join their side?
I think that we've gotten away from this idea of legitimate opposition. And I think when you get away from that idea, I mean, one, the party system has changed. And I think we could argue that since 2000, the party system has changed. The 21st century. When I teach political history, I always say we're stopping in the 21st century because things change so drastically. And so when you take away that idea of legitimate opposition, it is so, the way that each party views the government is so radically different. And so I would not say that we have, they're not small parties right now. I mean, these are big, fundamental beliefs in how the government should operate and what type of government we should have, even at this point. So, yeah, the getting away from legitimate opposition is dangerous in a two-party system. I mean, it's not.
I definitely agree that there's this disagreement over legitimate opposition. I don't know that I think different perspectives are at stake, but I don't think great interests are at stake between the two parties today. And that because it's not great interests, there's this notion that it's almost like, Methodists and Presbyterians trying to convince each other to join their religion. And that when they won't, you get really upset.
Yeah.
And that, because there should be no obstacle to a Methodist becoming a Presbyterian in some people's minds. There's no, I have universal truth, so why aren't you a Presbyterian like me? Right? And I'm not a Presbyterian, to be clear, but I'm just using it as an example. And so that when you say, no, I'm a happy Methodist, right? If me, the Presbyterian, I'd be like, well, that's illegitimate. I have universal truth.
Right.
What's your problem? And that because we've lost this maybe it's because we've lost this notion of great interests that are actually at stake between the two parties. We're fighting over, and we're ultimately fighting over we're fighting over great things.
Right.
But there's no real barrier in our minds to somebody from the other party joining somebody from another party joining my party or vice versa. And therefore that allows us to be a lot more hostile and a lot more vicious with each other.
Right.
Because we almost feel rejected when the other side when somebody won't join my party.
Exactly.
Because we can't understand why they wouldn't.
Wrong. Right. Yeah. Exactly. There must be something wrong with that person or that ideology. And again, it comes back to this idea, because that's illegitimate. So they should join my party because it is legitimate. Yes.
Whereas, in Van Buren's mind, this according to Hofstadter, they're a big merchant from Boston. They're not going to have any interest in joining my coalition of Western New York farmers. And, why would they? It makes no sense. They shouldn't be in my party.
Right. Yeah, you have to
And
choose where to spend campaign money. You have to choose where to spend resources and time, and who are you going to convince? And he gets that. Van
yeah,
Buren gets that.
then at that point it becomes no barrier to actually having a perfectly legitimate and professional relationship with that merchant from Boston when you understand that your interests are just different,
Right.
and they're never
Right.
going to join your church. Anyway, I went way too far afield there, Marie. I'm sorry.
No,
Apparently, I
no,
wanted to get
no.
on
I
a
think that was
soapbox.
good. Yeah.
Apparently, I want.
No, I think that was good.
Okay, so what books? We're running out of time here, but what books would you think of after reading this that somebody should read? That's another.
Um, book wise, like I'm going to go the author direction instead of books. But I think that the most well known, the biggest author that Hofstadter influenced is Eric Foner. Foner was his last doctoral student. He took his seat at Columbia after he was gone. And although he doesn't write, I mean, Foner is in a different school. He's in a different school of thought. He's looking more social, more New Left type direction, but he is absolutely influenced by Hofstadter, the way he wrote, the way he looked at ideas, the way he researched. So I think that if you like Hofstadter, even though it's not going to be exactly the same, you've got to look at Foner. You've got to look at Sean Lewentz if you're going to do that, or, look at this. Ira Katz-Nelson is one of his students. And these authors write so beautifully. And so when you read Hofstadter and you realize, okay, well, then it makes sense that he has influenced these men, even if they don't agree with him completely, because they don't all agree with him completely, and the way he talks about ideas instead of institutions, because they do think you should look at institutions more in some cases. And that's a lot of the backlash that Hofstadter got, was ignoring women. I mean, completely leaves women out of this narrative. I mean, there's nothing. And so they're going to pick up that and they're going to run with it. And Foner especially is going to include more of that in his work. But they are so influenced by Hofstadter. So I think you have to, that's the direction I would suggest after this.
Yeah, I mean, then Hofstadter, he does quote Abigail Adams once.
That's true. That's true. One time. She's always one you can throw in there that these political historians throw in there at times. But nothing. I mean, and women are political. They are absolutely involved in our political system. Yeah. Yes.
And there's no, and in this book, there's no real wrestling with the notion of slavery or anything like that. That is not what it's a different topic, right?
Yes, exactly. That's, the book we wish he'd wrote versus the book he wrote. You can't argue about the book, what's not there. And so, no, he doesn't, that's not what he is there to do. And he gets backlash for that. He gets a lot of pushback for that.
But, and I mean, rightly so, but also, he's writing this, he's analyzing James Monroe's political.
Right. I mean, Monroe, there's only, so much you can do with that.
Right. All right, Marie, well, I've tremendously enjoyed this conversation. I'm so glad you chose this book. Absolutely wonderful. And again, I have to reframe several of my lectures after reading this book.
It changes you. I appreciate you agreeing to read it, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Absolutely. All right, Marie, well, thank you very much. And thanks so much for listening. Make sure to like and subscribe on Spotify and Apple. We'll be up on YouTube pretty soon, too. Not sure exactly when that's going to happen, but it will happen. And thank you very much for listening. And have a great day.
Yes. Bye.
Oh, shoot. Wrong button.